This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, a vibrant online learning community providing high-quality educational content, the opportunity to connect with peers, and an outlet for new ideas in the field of nonprofit fundraising research. Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with Adrian Salmon, Vice President at Grenzebach Clear & Associates.
If you imagine that you're talking to a donor and you aren't allowed to lie, and the donor says to you, "Tell me, what exactly do you do with my data?" Then think about what you might be compelled to say under those circumstances, how you would absolutely frankly describe the processes that you went through with their personal data. And if any of that makes you cringe inside and think, "Oh, goodness, that really doesn't sound good," then you should really think about whether you ought to be doing it.
Hello, Adrian. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
Hello, Jen, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So our topic today is data, donors, and privacy. But before we jump into it, I'd like to ask you about your story. And I couldn't help but notice that on your LinkedIn profile, your summary starts with the phrase, "I love fundraising," which really made my heart sing. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share your story about how you fell in love with fundraising.
Absolutely. It's a slightly long story, but so back in the day, when I was at university, before I was at university, I was a musician and studied English literature, and I was a choral scholar actually at Trinity College, Cambridge. And so after 3 wonderful years of doing that, and then another 3 or 4 years after university, singing in cathedral choirs in the UK, which is a job over here if you're a singer. I sang at Winchester Cathedral, New College, Oxford, etc. I realised that, I was good, but, a career in professional singing was probably not going to happen for me. And I started to look for other things I could do. And I'd always been fascinated with people, and I'd found the person other people came to tell problems to, and I, ended up being on the receiving end of lots of confidences. So I actually started out a training in counselling and psychotherapy, which, as some of you will know, is very expensive. You have to pay for the fees, you have to pay for your own therapy, you have to then take on clients unpaid and pay for your own supervision. And after a year or so of doing this, I was starting to run out of money very severely. And my partner, Fiona, with whom I'm still together with, said, "Oh, a friend of mine has set up a fundraising company. They do telephone fundraising for arts and cultural organisations. You'd be perfect for him because you know all about the arts and you can talk behind legs off a donkey. You should apply for the job." So I applied to David Dixon, Fiona's friend, who's a wonderful fundraiser, and I became one of the first telephone fundraisers at his agency, which was called the Phone Room in Oxford. And after about 6 months of doing telephone fundraising, I was head over heels in love with it. Because I couldn't believe that you could call people up on behalf of a theatre and orchestra and opera company, have these wonderful conversations with them about their enthusiasms, and they would give money over the phone. But B, I was fascinated with the way that David and his team used the data behind the scenes to drive what we were doing. And, we would test out different versions of scripts and see which would raise the most money for the client. And after about 6 months of doing this, I thought, well, here's the thing. On the one hand, I'm training to do counselling and psychotherapy, which is all about how to influence people's behaviour for the good, and it's costing me an awful lot of money. On the other hand, I'm doing telephone fundraising for the arts, which is also all about how to influence people's behaviour for the good, and I'm being paid for it. Which one should I carry on with? And I went to see David and said to him, "Is there anything else I can do with the firm, with the Phone Room?" And so over the next 4 or 5 years, I went from being a telephone fundraiser to being head of client services and new business for the agency. It was one of those things where if you get in with a company at the beginning, there's often that opportunity to grow as the company grows. And that was the way it was for me. So that was my beginnings in fundraising. That was how I fell in love with it, was through that very extraordinary environment of the telephone fundraising agency.
That is an amazing story. I'm so glad I asked you. I've never heard of anyone doing telephone calling who fell in love with it. That's just wonderful. That's astounding.
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing. I mean, we would do things like, if we were doing a telephone campaign for the Royal Opera House or the South Bank Centre in London, both of which were clients, we would take all the team down to those places and they would be briefed there and they would be shown around, so that we could really have genuine conversations with those supporters, those ticket buyers, those friends, about the places that they loved. We would know that the handrails of the South Bank Centre, the handrails at the Royal Festival Hall, have a little groove down the middle for your thumb, so your thumb just slides down. That the limestone on the walls is full of fossils. We could talk about the crush bar at the Royal Opera House, because they'd been there. And when you've got that level of connection with the place that you're fundraising for, the conversations become fantastic.
That's a beautiful thing. That sounds like it was fundraising done right.
Yeah, I like to think so.
That's fabulous. Well, with that, the love of fundraising, I did want to ask you about this recent scrutiny of fundraising data in particular and prospect research with the
UK.
Right. And the upcoming General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. I heard all the headlines and the stories about the Information Commissioner's office issuing fines. It just feels like a slap in the face. What's happening?
Well, you may well ask, and a lot of us in the UK are asking the same things. We tend to refer to the events now, going back to May 2015. And really, it all started in May 2015 with a very sad event, which was that a 92-year-old lady called Olive Cook, who had been a proud supporter of dozens of different charities and a lifelong volunteer for one of them, the Royal British Legion, which runs the annual Poppy Appeal in the UK for veterans of war. She committed suicide. Now, as it turned out, the inquest decided she committed suicide because she had long-standing chronic depression, which was terribly sad. But a couple of years prior to that, she'd featured in a story in her local newspaper, surrounded by all the fundraising appeals that she received on a monthly basis from the charities that she supported, and in fact many that she didn't. And a stray comment by one of her friends, oh, she probably committed suicide because of all those charities chasing her for money, led the newspapers to have an absolute field day with the UK charity sector. Unfortunately, the correction, of course, never got as much prominence as the original rumour. Unfortunately, when the newspapers started digging, they did find things that the charity sector shouldn't have been doing. In particular, the fact that many charities were members of a data swapping, list swapping scheme. And that in itself is not against the law, but what was wrong was they had not given their donors adequate information about the extent to which their details might be exchanged with other charities. And that caused the Information Commissioner to launch an investigation. And along the way, with that information, the Information Commissioner also discovered that charities were doing wealth screening in very high volumes on their donor base. I say discovered because I think, there had been briefings to the Information Commissioner on previous occasions that charities did do this kind of work. But I don't think the Information Commissioner had grasped the scale to which it had been done in some cases. Now, again, wealth screening, not illegal, but it is under the European data protection regulations, the ones that were already in force from 1998, important for charities to be transparent with their supporters about how their data is being used. And unfortunately, not many charities were very upfront with saying precisely what, wealth screening and profiling activities they were undertaking. And so the Information Commissioner concluded that they had not been fairly processing supporters' data and handed down fines to about 13 charities for that activity.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
harsh.
that's harsh. And it's also fed into, I think, an ongoing thing about charity fundraising. And I'm also a fellow of Regare Think Tank's advisory panel. Ian McQuillan, who's the director of Regare, has written quite extensively about what he calls an ideological attack on fundraising. Now, by that, he doesn't mean some kind of conspiracy theory, but what he means is that there are two very different ideologies at work in the voluntary sector, not-for-profit space. One is the ideology of voluntarism, and that tends to be the ideology that everybody who doesn't work in fundraising has. And that's the idea that, charity fundraising is something done on a shoestring by people in their spare time. It's committed volunteers doing the best they can. And, Dan Pallotta has also talked about this in his book, Uncharitable. The other ideology is the one that I think most of us in the fundraising profession would share, which is the ideology of professionalism, that says that what we do is we very skillfully and with great thought to our charity's resources carry out fundraising as a way to proactively build relationships with donors and supporters that over time is going to lead to, substantial and sustainable income. But that ideology of professionalism involves paying people appropriately for the jobs they do and the level of experience they have. And it involves doing things like prospect research and using data, all of which don't chime well with the ideology of voluntarism. And if you want, Ian's blogs are very good on this topic and well worth a read, and you'll find them on the Regare website. So there was an ideological clash as well, which of course is great for newspapers.
Yeah, absolutely. It sells newspapers. Well, it's interesting because I had wondered if this was sort of a global trend or kind of isolated in the UK. And when you tell the story about the event, it reminds me of when the American Civil Liberties Union had a big scandal in the news because they were using a well screening and they had not, it actually was it was almost against their privacy policies at the time. So what they needed to do was amend the policies. But because of what they do, American Civil Liberties, it was a big deal. Yeah, it was early days in well screening, so people weren't aware of what it was or how it was being used. It was early 2000s.
Yeah. And a lot of donors don't understand that actually when you do well screening on people's data, the result in most cases is that they get ruled out of, you being asked for more money. But of course, that isn't always the way it's characterized in the press. Charities snooping on donors so that they can ask them for more. Donors' generous contributions not deemed to be enough by charities were the kinds of headlines flying around in the UK. And were the language being used by the Information Commissioner as well, which is pretty unprecedented for the Information Commission to use that kind of language.
I do remember feeling like the language was inflammatory coming from the ICO.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Arguably.
Well, now that we have other scandals like Facebook with Cambridge Analytica, do you think this is a global trend? Are we going to see more backlash against prospect research? Are we going to see different language that we're going to try to introduce? What do you see happening?
I think privacy is now a very, very hot topic. Culturally, between the UK and the US, I think there are some differences. By and large, US, or at least the US folk that I've met, seem to be, on the whole, less concerned about the use of their data and the fact that companies may carry out all kinds of profiling on them than over here in the UK. And I think there's a different attitude to money as well. And so I think, money is always a trigger topic for Brits. It's one of the things that we're very interested in, but don't want to admit we're very interested in.
That's kind of funny. Well, I have noticed the more I travel to the UK, that there is a sort of a nuance or a subtle formality in communications. I had thought there wasn't much difference from my early vacations, but now that I've talked to fundraising professionals more in the past few years, there are some cultural differences for sure.
Yes, there are. I think the biggest one is that British people hate to say no. So we have lots of codes for no. And, that's very interesting. Let me get back to you on that. Is a British person's code for no. You're not going to hear from me again. Or, or the classic maybe. So as a telephone fundraiser, I would often speak to potential donors to charities. And the classic thing is, oh, this sounds really interesting. Could you send me some more information in the post? Well, 9 out of 10 times for a British person, that means thank you, but no. And maybes. We used to find this, within the UK, there would be a big difference between England and Scotland. So in English fundraising campaigns, we'd always have about 20 to 30% of the responses being maybe, whereas in Scotland, generally it was no more than 10 to 20% of the responses being maybe, and there'd be a much higher conversion rate on the maybes as well. So British people were using maybe as code for no, but Scottish people weren't so afraid to say no, and so the maybes were actual real maybes.
Very interesting. Now, I know here in the US, the Pew Research Center does a lot of surveys of Americans about how they feel about data protection, data privacy. I haven't seen a more recent one. Can't wait until they do their next one. Where can someone look for that type of information about things happening in the UK or in the EU?
What, you mean surveys on people's attitudes?
Yes, around data.
Well, I think around data, there's not much, I don't think. I mean, the obvious place to look would be the sort of data protection authority in the relevant countries. So in the UK, that would be the Information Commissioner's Office, who would be most interested in that kind of thing. What I can tell you is one of some results of some of our clients and universities sending out privacy policies in the UK, because one of the requirements for data protection is that the way you handle people's personal data should be outlined very clearly and transparently in a document called a privacy notice. And you're required to send a privacy notice to your constituents within 28 days of first holding their data, or the first time that you intend to make contact with them, basically as soon as you can. And so if you make a change to your privacy notice, and a lot of universities have made changes to their privacy notices so that they're more transparent and upfront about prospect research and wealth screening, obviously those have to be communicated out. So a number of universities have done this, and I think, sent out hundreds of thousands of emails to their constituents with the new privacy notices. They've had something like a 0.5% click-through rate on these privacy notices, and responses from people opting out of this kind of activity in single figures.
Wow.
So I think there's a disjunct there between, how much privacy gets talked about, and when it actually comes down to it, how much individuals really respond to stuff around their privacy and around the ways in which you're going to use their data.
Well, that sounds like news headlines, and new legislation, does drive conversation more than the actual attitudes of the population.
Yes.
But the fines are real.
The fines are real.
And I'm wondering if you're a UK fundraiser or prospect researcher, or if you're in the US or any other country and you have UK constituents of any kind, where do you go to find out what should I be doing? What kind of language should I be using in my privacy policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some very good resources available. So obviously the first is the Information Commissioner themselves. They have now a substantial body of guidance on GDPR on their website. And because they've been having so many conversations with the higher education sector and the charity sector in the UK, a lot of that guidance is now updated with specific examples for universities and other charities. The other place I'd point you towards is the Institute of Fundraising, which has done some very good guides on GDPR specifically for fundraising charities in the UK. So that's the UK Institute of Fundraising. And I've written a few posts myself, which you'll find on the GGNA website on our blog section. And you'll find a number of things that I've written there. And I've also just recorded a webinar for CASE that should be available soon. That's the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, detailing how US fundraisers should be approaching the issue of GDPR.
Great. And I'm going to go ahead and put links to all those resources with this podcast so people can find it. But before I let you go today, I'm wondering if you had to, could you sum up this data privacy trend or regulation in a rule of thumb?
Yeah, I could. So I'd say that there are three, there are a couple of keywords that should govern the way that you approach that. And one of them is transparency, and the other one is frankness and plain speaking. And the Information Commissioner is very keen that organizations, companies, charities, whoever is processing personal data, doesn't attempt to obfuscate or hide what they're doing behind, a wall of jargon or stuff that's very hard to understand. So this is not my saying, it's another data protection practitioner's saying. But essentially, if you imagine that you're talking to a donor and for some reason you're under a truth field and you aren't allowed to lie, and the donor says to you, tell me, what exactly do you do with my data? Then think about what you might be compelled to say under those circumstances. How you would absolutely frankly describe the processes that you went through with their personal data. And if any of that makes you cringe inside and think, oh, goodness, that really doesn't sound good, then you should really think about whether you ought to be doing it.
Excellent. Very sage. Very helpful. I really appreciate all of your insights. I'm thankful that you shared your time with us all the way across the Atlantic. And I look forward to reading more of your writing about this.
Thank you. Yes. And I'm sure you probably will, because I don't think this is a topic that's going away, anytime soon. And I think that, there'll be a year or two as people get used to it all in practice after May the 25th.
That was Adrienne Salmon, Vice President at Grenzenbach Gleer & Associates. Will you be attending the APRA Prospect Development Conference in Pittsburgh this August? You'll find Adrienne's colleagues, Kat Banakis and Elisa Schoenberger, presenting a session on GDPR on Friday at 4:15 p.m. And I'm excited to share that you'll also find me and the Prospect Research Institute in the exhibit hall for the first time ever. Be sure to stop by and say hello. To find chat bites and more prospect research resources, join us in the Institute's learning community at prospectresearchinstitute.org.